Today's story is a bit different from the crime and more mysterious. It's about a mysterious tomb, or let's say a grave, in which whatever happened about 200 years ago is quite shocking. This story is from Barbados, one of the countries that make up the West Indies. The West Indies is a group of countries famous for their cricket, food, and music. But buried beneath the land of Barbados is a secret that continues to astonish people to this day. To know this secret, we have to go back about 200 years, meaning to the 19th century, when, like almost every other country, Barbados was also under British rule. Many English people came from England and settled in Barbados with their families. Among those families was one whose head was named Colonel Thomas Chase, who was a colonel in British Army. Colonel Thomas Chase was a very cruel and angry man who mistreated the people of Barbados, whom he kept as slaves. Because of this, he was notorious there and people hated him. At that time, whoever was wealthy and rich would buy a permanent grave in the cemetery so that whenever someone in their family or relatives died, their coffins could be buried in that grave. This was not a normal grave. Instead, it was like an underground chamber. Colonel Thomas Chase, being very rich and wealthy, also bought a grave in 1807 in the Austin area of Barbados, next to the Christ Church Parish Church Cemetery. This grave was 3.7 meters deep and 2 meters wide underground. When Colonel Thomas bought that grave, there was already a wooden coffin inside it, which belonged to a woman named Mrs. Thomasina Goddard, who was a woman of that family from which he bought the grave. As she died the same year, Thomas left that coffin inside the grave, and because he was now the new owner of that grave, he had a new name written on it, and that name was the Chase Vault. Shortly after buying this grave, in February 1808, Thomas' 2-year-old daughter, Mary Ann Chase, died. After her death, Mary's body was placed in a lead coffin. Lead is a very strong metal, and coffins made of lead are much stronger and heavier than the wooden coffins. Anyway, after placing Mary's body in the coffin, she was taken near the grave, and 6-7 people together lifted the stone that was on top of the grave, which weighed around 500 kilograms or more. After removing it, Mary's coffin was taken down into the grave and placed there, and then the grave was sealed with the stone again. Approximately 4 years later, in July 1812, Thomas Chase's other daughter, Dorcas Chase, aged 12, also passed away. After her death, Dorcas' body was also placed in the lead coffin and buried in this grave, where her younger sister had been buried 4 years earlier. Now, there were a total of 3 coffins in the grave, one belonging to Thomas Chase's youngest daughter, Mary, one to his elder daughter, Dorcas, and one to Mrs. Thomasina Goddard, which was already present in the grave. After just a month, in August 1812, Colonel Thomas Chase also passed away. His body was also placed in a strong lead coffin. Combining both his body weight and the coffin's weight, the total weight of Thomas Chase's coffin became approximately 109 kilograms. It took 8 people to lift his coffin. After that, his coffin was brought to the cemetery. But when the stone covering the grave was removed to bury Thomas Chase's coffin, people were shocked to find that 3 coffins that had been previously placed in the grave were scattered around. Mary Ann Chase's coffin was upside down in a corner of a grave, while the other 2 coffins had also moved from their original position. Just a month ago, these 3 coffins had been placed straight on the ground in the middle of the grave, but now they were in a weird position. Colonel Thomas Chase's coffin was placed in the grave, and all the other coffins were placed back to their original position, and the grave was sealed with the stone. The fact that the coffins had moved inside the grave shocked the people. Initially, they thought that it might be the work of the slave because Colonel Thomas Chase was known for his cruelty towards slaves. So it is possible that the slave had tampered with the coffins in anger. However, it seemed impossible for one person to move the heavy lead coffins, let alone rearrange them. Investigations were conducted and many people were questioned, but no conclusion was reached. After that, 4 more years passed, and on September 1816, an 11-year-old child from this family named Charles Brewster Ames also died. After his death, he was also placed in a lead coffin and taken to be buried in this grave. When the grave was opened, people were once again shocked because this time too, all the coffins had been shifted from their places. Even Colonel Thomas Chase 109 kilograms coffin was not in its place. With some difficulty, all the coffins were placed back to its position, and then the fifth coffin belonging to the Charles Brewster Ames was also buried in the grave and sealed. Now, among the people there, the belief started spreading slowly that the whole family was cursed because ever since Thomas bought that grave, one by one, people from his family were dying, whether they were young or old. Many people began to believe that the black magic was being performed on the bodies, and now people even stopped passing near the grave. After just 2 more months, on November 1816, another person from this family, Samuel Brewster, also died. He was also taken to be buried in this grave, but this time a crowd had gathered, wanting to see if there was any disturbance with the coffins this time. When the grave was opened, once again all 5 coffins were scattered around. One coffin was leaning against the grave wall, another was in a corner, and one coffin was tilted towards another coffin. It seemed like someone had picked up the coffins and tossed them around because all the metal coffins looked slightly damaged. People couldn't understand how someone could lift and throw the coffins around, especially the coffin of Mrs. Thomasina Goddard, which was the only wooden coffin and was in such a bad condition that it was about to break. Therefore, that coffin was tied with the iron wires and then placed back in its proper place along with the rest of the coffins. After that, all the remaining coffins were also placed properly, and Samuel Brewster's new coffin was also placed with them. Then, many Englishmen entered the grave to thoroughly investigate inside and outside the grave to check if there was any other way into the grave from inside. They even checked the walls of the grave with chains and hammer but found nothing wrong inside the grave. Then they sealed the grave with the same stone, and this time they sealed it with the cement. It is said that for the next 2 years, whoever passed by the grave heard strange and horrifying noises coming from inside the grave, and after it got dark, no one dared to wander near the cemetery. Many people said that when they passed by their horses would stop near the grave and their mouth would start foaming. Slowly, this news spread throughout Barbados, and because Englishmen ruled there at that time, this news reached even the highest ranking English officer, and they too were shocked by this incident. After these 2 years, on July 1819, another woman named Thomasina Clark's coffin was brought to be buried in the grave. Governor Lord Combambier of Barbados himself arrived with his investigations team to see how much truth was there in this. After they opened the grave, this time all 6 coffins were scattered around again. But the only wooden coffin in the grave, which belonged to Mrs. Thomasina Goddard and was tied with the wires last time, was completely safe and in its place. After that, Lord Combermere ordered his professional investigators to thoroughly inspect the inside and outside of the grave, but they also found nothing wrong in the grave. Due to lack of space, Mrs. Thomasina Goddard's coffin was placed leaning against the wall of the grave, and the rest of the coffins were placed back in their positions. After that, Lord Combambier ordered the entire grave to be covered with the sand so that if anyone entered the grave, footprints would appear on the sand. Then the grave was sealed with the stone again, and the stone was sealed with the cement again. This time, Governor Lord Combambier himself put his official seal on top of the cement so that if anyone tried to remove the cement, it would be known. Now the people there started waiting for the grave to open again, and after 9 months, on April 1820, Barbados Governor Lord Combambier once again arrived with his investigators near the grave and asked for it to be opened. This time it was not to bury a coffin but to prove that it was the work of human and also dispel fear among people. On the day the grave was supposed to be opened, thousands of people gathered there, all eager to know what had happened this time. First, it was checked whether the seal placed by the governor on the cement was intact or not. The seal was perfectly intact. After that, the cement seal was broken, and when the English officers entered the grave to investigate after removing the 500-kilogram stone, no sign were found on the sand inside the grave. However, all the coffins buried inside the grave were not in their original position. Some were upside down, some were leaning against the wall, and some were in other corner. After seeing this, everyone became convinced that this was not the work of human but of some supernatural power. After that, all the coffins present in the grave were removed and reburied elsewhere, and the grave was permanently sealed. Slowly, as time passed, a story emerged, and it was revealed that Colonel Thomas' eldest daughter Dorcas, who was buried in the grave before Thomas, died because Thomas used to beat and abuse his daughter severely. He also subjected her to physical torture like his slaves. It was also said that Thomas Chase sexually abused his daughter, which led Dorcas to stop eating and drinking, causing her death. And because Dorcas' death was not natural and she had starved herself to death before time, her soul did all this. This story became famous because before burying Dorcas' coffin in the grave, everything inside that grave was perfectly fine. But since Dorcas' coffin was buried in that grave, all this mysterious event started happening. It's been more than 200 years since then, and during this time, many investigations had been conducted on that grave. However, modern people who do not believe in ghost or spirit had two theories about what happened inside that grave. The first theory was that whatever happened in that grave was due to an earthquake. However, this theory was rejected because if all this had happened due to the earthquakes, then all the other graves in that cemetery would have experienced the same, but all the graves in the cemetery were perfectly fine. The second theory was that due to the rainwater seeping into the grave, all this happened as Barbados frequently experienced heavy rainfall. However, this theory also had some flaws because among all the coffins present in that grave, if one coffin was left aside, then all the other coffins were made of lead and could not float in water. The coffin, which belonged to Colonel Thomas, was more than 100 kilograms and it would require a lot of water to float. Also, if this were true, then the coffins would have not been damaged and scattered as they were found. They would have simply floated up due to the water and then come back down. So, this theory of water was also rejected. Today, more than 200 years later, that grave is still present in the cemetery of Christ Church in Barbados, and the records of all the people buried in that grave was still recorded in the church's book. After that incident, neither has anyone bought that grave again, nor has anyone buried anyone else inside it. Many people still visit that grave to see it, but what actually happened inside that grave due to water, earthquake, or whether it was really done by Dorcas soul, no one knows the truth till date. So, this was the story of the mysterious grave in Barbados. Thank you for watching the video. I look forward to bring you more compelling stories and discussion in the future. Until next time, take care and stay curious.